She was 22 and homeless in all the ways that mattered. No living parents, no share of the estate she had been raised to serve, no plan beyond the next week, just a small tin box of her mother's sewing things and 11 shillings knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. And with that 11 shillings and a solicitor's cold letter, Eleanor Mercer was placed in the old castle keep at Norley, the one nobody in the parish had entered in 80 years. But what nobody knew was that behind its bricked-up inner door, waiting inside a sealed chamber on the second floor, was something that would change her life forever and reverse everything the estate believed about her place in the world. Settle in with a cup of something warm and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. And if you care for quiet stories of women who refused to be discarded, do stay close to the end. Eleanor Mercer had been born in 1849 in the gatekeeper's cottage at the edge of the Norley estate, the only child of Thomas Mercer, an under-steward, and his wife Anne, who had come up from Somerset as a lady's maid before her marriage. The cottage was 2 rooms of local sandstone and a scullery with a slate floor, and Eleanor remembered it always as smelling faintly of coal smoke and of the lavender her mother sewed into every drawer. Her father was a quiet man who kept the estate's tenancy ledgers in a hand so neat that the vicar once said the pages looked printed, and from him Eleanor learned to read a column of figures before she was 7, and to know the difference between a rent in arrears and a rent forgiven, and to see how the small language of money moved beneath the surface of ordinary lives. Her mother, who had a delicate constitution and a great patience for teaching, put a needle in Eleanor's hand at 4, and by the time the girl was 10, she could turn a collar, patch a linen sheet invisibly, mend fine lace, and cut a pattern from a folded newspaper without waste. There was in the household a quiet pride in doing things properly, and a quieter understanding that they were people who served, and that the great house at the other end of the beach avenue was another country, though only half a mile away. The wound came when Eleanor was 13. First, her mother died of a lung complaint that took her over one long February, and then, 2 years later, her father was thrown from a horse on the Norley Lane and lived only 3 days after. The estate, then held by old Sir Reginald Hollowell, took Eleanor in as a kind of half-charge, half-charity, and she was moved from the cottage to a small room above the servants' hall, where she was expected to make herself useful without ever quite being paid as a servant or treated as kin. It was in that awkward suspension between stations that she was taken up by Mrs. Hester Bramble, the estate's housekeeper, a childless widow of about 60 who wore the same black bombazine every day of the year and carried her keys on a steel chatelaine polished to the color of a river stone. Mrs. Bramble had seen at once what the family had not, that the girl was clever and orderly and grieving with the patience of an older woman, and she took Eleanor under her wing without ever quite saying so. In the still room and the linen press and the store cupboards, and later in the small parlor where the household accounts were kept, Mrs. Bramble taught her how to run a house of 40 rooms on a fixed weekly sum, how to stretch a joint of mutton over 4 days, how to preserve damsons and quinces, how to write a firm letter to a coal merchant, and how to read a parish register with an eye for what had been altered and what had not. "A woman who can keep books and mend cloth," Mrs. Bramble said once, folding a sheet with Eleanor at the other corner, "will never be entirely at the mercy of a man's whim." She said it as she might have remarked on the weather, and Eleanor never forgot it. From her mother, Eleanor kept one thing above all others, a small tin box, painted once with roses, and now worn nearly plain, that held her mother's sewing implements. A pair of steel scissors from Sheffield, a bone thimble yellowed with use, a paper of good needles, a length of black silk thread, and a folded square of unfinished linen on which Anne Mercer had begun a christening cap for a grandchild she would never see. Eleanor carried the tin from cottage to servant's room, to attic to the trunk beneath her narrow bed, and she opened it in the evenings not to sew, but simply to look, to lift the thimble and set it back, to run her thumb over the scissors' cool blades, and to feel the presence of a woman who had loved her without condition and without measure. It was the one object in her life she would not have parted with for money, and it was the one object she made sure to pack first, wrapped in a piece of flannel, when the solicitor's letter came in the spring of her 22nd year. By then, old Sir Reginald was dead. His son, Mr. Ambrose Hallowell, had inherited a heavily mortgaged estate, and Mrs. Bramble too had gone, carried off by a winter fever the January before, leaving Eleanor without the one person in Norley who had ever spoken plainly on her behalf. The new master had a young wife from Bath, who did not care for the sight of a grown woman kept about the place on no clear terms, and there began that slow, cold rearrangement by which unwanted people are made to feel first inconvenient and then impossible. Eleanor was moved from her attic room to a smaller one, then relieved of the still room keys, then quietly told the accounts would be kept henceforward by Mr. Ambrose's own clerk. She met each reduction with the same composure Mrs. Bramble had taught her, folding her hands and saying, "Very well, sir," and going about whatever work remained. She did not cry, and she did not complain, and she wrote in her small pocket-book each week the exact sum of her small remaining wages and the exact price of the candles she used, because she knew, with the same certainty her father had shown for a column of figures, that the letter she had long expected would come at last, and that, when it came, she would need to know precisely what she had. The letter came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, delivered by a boy from the village on a piebald pony, and it lay on the small deal table in the servants' hall for nearly an hour before anyone thought to bring it up to Eleanor. She was in the linen press when Mrs. Ivy Marsden, the new upper housemaid, put her head round the door, and said, without meeting her eye, that there was a paper for her from the solicitor at Ludham. Eleanor set down the pile of pillow slips she had been counting, wiped her hands on the front of her apron, and went down to fetch it. The envelope was of good cream paper, sealed in red wax with the mark of Messrs. Pettifer and Wren, and inside was a single folded sheet written in a careful clerkly hand. It was brief, as such letters generally are when they are meant to close a matter rather than open one. It informed Miss Eleanor Mercer that, upon a full review of the late Sir Reginald Hallowell's papers, and the present accounts of the Norley estate, no provision could be identified in her favor under any settled instrument, and that Mr. Ambrose Hallowell, being under no legal obligation and finding the estate unable to sustain the further courtesy of her lodging in the main house, had directed that she remove herself from the great house by the end of the month. The letter added, in a phrase Eleanor read twice, that in consideration of her father's long service, Mr. Hallowell was pleased to offer her the use of the old castle keep at the north end of the park as a lodging, without rent, for such period as she might require, though no repairs would be undertaken upon it and no servants placed at her disposal. It was signed by Mr. Pettifer himself in a small tidy hand, and there was nothing further. Eleanor folded the letter along its original creases, put it into the pocket of her apron, and went back up to the linen press to finish counting the pillow slips, because Mrs. Bramble had once told her that no piece of household work should be left half done on account of bad news, since bad news would still be bad news when the work was finished, but the work would at least be finished. That evening she washed her 2 spare shifts, mended the hem of her gray wool dress, and packed her trunk. Into it went her mother's tin box wrapped in flannel, 3 shifts, 2 petticoats, 2 dresses, a Sunday bonnet, a shawl of Mrs. Bramble's given her the winter before, her pocketbook, a small ink bottle and steel pen, a Bible with her mother's name on the fly-leaf, a pair of woolen stockings darned at the heels, and a small parcel of dried lavender tied in muslin. She counted the 11 shillings out of her tea-caddy, knotted them into the corner of a linen handkerchief, and put the handkerchief inside the tin box beside the bone thimble. She said nothing to anyone in the house of what the letter had said, and no one asked. On the last morning of April, before the household was fully up, she carried her trunk down the back stairs herself, one end at a time, and set it in the yard beside the mounting block to wait for the estate's carter, who had been instructed to convey her and her belongings as far as the keep and no further. The morning was gray and cold, with a thin northeasterly wind coming off the fields, and the yard smelled of coal smoke and wet straw and the sharper smell of horses being harnessed. The carter, a stooped man of 60 named Mr. Job Halliday, touched his cap to her without speaking and helped her lift the trunk into the back of the low cart. He had known her father, and there was a plain courtesy in the way he arranged a piece of oiled sacking over her trunk against the possibility of rain. Eleanor climbed up onto the plank seat beside him in her gray wool dress and Mrs. Bramble's shawl and her Sunday bonnet, with her tin box in a canvas bag on her lap, and Mr. Halliday clicked to the horse and they moved out of the yard and down the beech avenue. The beeches were only just coming into leaf, a thin green wash upon the black branches, and rooks were calling from the tops of them in the raw air. They passed the gatekeeper's cottage where she had been born, its chimney smoking now for another family, and Eleanor looked at it once and then looked ahead down the lane. The road from the great house to the north end of the park was almost 2 miles by the cart track that skirted the home farm and the paddocks, and turned up along the ridge above the old fish ponds. Mr. Halliday said nothing for the first mile, and Eleanor was grateful for it, because there was nothing to be said that would not have been either untrue or unnecessary. The wind pulled at the ribbons of her bonnet, and she tied them tighter under her chin. They passed a field where a boy was setting a hurdle for sheep, and he stopped his work to watch the cart go by, and Eleanor understood, without resentment, that within a day the parish would know a Mercer girl had been sent to live in the keep. At the top of the ridge, Mr. Halliday drew the horse up for a moment to breathe it, and Eleanor saw for the first time from this angle the whole extent of the Norley estate spread out below her. The great house at the south end with its glass houses catching a little pale light, the home farm with its ricks, the pale line of the drive, the church tower half a mile beyond the park wall, and, at the north end where they were bound, rising alone above a stand of unpruned yews and a great tangle of ivy, the old castle keep itself. It was square and gray and squat, 3 stories of coursed local sandstone streaked black with weather, with narrow windows and a slate roof that from this distance looked whole enough but discolored in patches like a piece of ill-mended cloth. Around it ran the remains of a low curtain wall enclosing what had once been a cobbled bailey and was now a knee-high sea of nettles and dock. No smoke rose from any of its chimneys. No door stood open. Eleanor looked at it steadily for a long moment, and then nodded once, as though acknowledging a fact rather than a fate, and Mr. Halliday clicked to the horse, and they went on down the far side of the ridge toward it, the wind rising a little as they descended, and the first flecks of a cold, thin rain beginning to strike the shoulders of her shawl. They came down through a lane so overgrown with hazel and briar that the cart's wheels scraped against green wood on either side, and at the foot of the ridge the track turned through a broken gate of iron railings, one leaf leaning inward on its hinges and the other gone entirely, and passed into what had once been the outer bailey of the keep. Mr. Halliday drew the horse up on a patch of flagged stone still visible beneath the grass, and Eleanor got down. The bailey was perhaps 40 paces across, roughly circular, walled by a rubble curtain no more than shoulder-high now and pierced in 3 places by weather. The keep itself stood at its center, a plain square tower of sandstone set on a plinth of 2 courses of larger blocks, the mortar between them furred with lichen the color of old butter, and its door, a low arched door of oak banded with iron, blackened by rain, and pitted where nails had rusted out of it, set within a shallow porch on the south face. A padlock hung on the door in a hasp so freshly cut into the wood that the raw yellow of the fresh grain still showed. Mr. Halliday drew a key from an oiled rag in his pocket and handed it to Eleanor without a word. She turned it in the padlock, lifted the hasp, and pushed the door open with her shoulder against its warping. Inside, the air was cold and dry and smelled of stone and old wood and the faint sweetness of long-dead pigeons in an upper chamber. The ground floor was a single room some 25 feet square, with a stone-flagged floor swept over by decades of dust into little gray dunes against the walls, a broad hearth on the north side deep enough to stand in, a small barred window in each of the other 3 walls, and a straight stair of oak treads rising in the eastern corner to the floor above. The plaster on the walls had once been whitewashed and was now the color of weak tea, and in 3 places long damp stains ran from ceiling to floor where a slate above had failed. Eleanor set her canvas bag on the broad windowsill and looked up. The stair rose to a landing which turned once and gave onto the second story. And at the head of the second stair she could see even from the ground a heavy oak door stood shut, and across its middle was set a course of new brick, plastered on the outside and painted the color of the stone about it. This was the sealed chamber the letter and the servants had spoken of, and its brickwork had the same fresh yellow-cut look as the padlock hasp, older by many years, but of the same class of work and done by the same intention. Eleanor stood a moment and looked at it, and then turned to Mr. Halliday, who had brought in the trunk and set it against the wall by the hearth, and thanked him. He touched his cap and said only that he would come back on Friday with a load of dry sticks and a sack of coal if she wished it. And she said she did wish it, and he went out into the rain and drove the horse away, and Eleanor was alone in the keep with the door closed behind her, and 11 shillings in the corner of a handkerchief inside her mother's tin box on the sill. She set to work without sitting down. She swept the ground floor with a stub of birch besom she found leaning behind the door, laid a small fire of what dry kindling she could gather from a broken hurdle in the bailey, and by dusk had a kettle warming on a hook she had straightened in the hearth. She slept that first night wrapped in her shawl on a folded blanket on the flagstones by the fire, and in the morning she began to go through the keep room by room with a small notebook and a piece of pencil, writing down what was there and what was wanting, exactly as Mrs. Bramble had once taught her to do when opening a house that had been shut for a season. On the first floor she found 2 chambers, one with the remains of a bedstead of black oak and a chest with its lid broken, the other empty but for a fallen cornice and a mouse's nest in a corner. On the second floor she found the landing, a small closet lined with hooks, a further chamber over the western end containing nothing at all, and at the east end the sealed door with its neat course of yellow brick set flush into the frame. She stood before it a long while. Around the bricked panel the old oak of the door still showed, black with age, and rubbed to a shine along the lower edge by generations of use before the wall had been set into it, and above the bricking she could see the top curve of a shallow arch and the head of an iron nail. She put her hand flat to the brick. It was cold and dry and quite sound. She went downstairs and fetched from her trunk a small hammer that had been her father's and a cold chisel of 2-inch blade she had brought from the estate's tool room without asking, and she began, patiently and without haste, to cut the mortar out of the topmost course of the bricking one joint at a time. The mortar was weak and old and came away in dry gray crumbs, and within an hour she had loosened 3 bricks along the top and lifted them out and set them on the floor of the landing beside her. Through the gap she could see nothing but darker air, and she smelled the stale, closed, faintly papery smell of a room that had been shut for a very long time. She worked on. By the middle of the afternoon she had taken down the bricking to the level of her knee, stepping back once every hour to rest her arms and drink cold water from a tin cup, and the door behind stood revealed with its old iron latch untouched. She lifted the latch. The door swung inward with the slow reluctance of hinges left long in one position, and she went in with a candle in a saucer held before her, ducking her head under the low arch. Inside was a small chamber of perhaps 12 feet by 10, with one narrow window blocked from outside by ivy, a plain oak table in the middle, a chair drawn up to it, and against the wall a locked iron-bound chest the size of a small sea trunk. On the table lay a folded paper, weighted by a heavy brass candlestick, and beside the candlestick a small leather wallet tied with a black ribbon, and beneath both, spread flat and held down at its corners by 4 pebbles, a parchment deed with a red seal still bright upon its lower edge, and beside that a bound parish register in brown calf, its spine lettered in faded gilt, Norley, Baptisms, Marriages and Burials, 1780 to 1815. Eleanor set the candle on the table and stood a moment with her hands at her sides, understanding, before she read a word, that the room had been prepared and left, and that whoever had prepared it had done so, knowing the door would be closed behind them and not opened for a long time, and that they had trusted whoever came next to know what to do. She sat down in the chair, which took her weight with a small creak of dry oak, and she read the folded paper first. It was in a firm, slightly slanted hand, in ink faded to the color of weak tea, and it began, "To whoever finds this room open." The writer gave his name as Mr. William Aldous Hallowell, second son of the Hallowell house, born 1762, and stated that he had lived in the keep as its sole tenant from 1815 until his death, which he expected shortly, being then 73 and in failing health. He wrote that he had been set aside from the family in early life by a settlement that favored his elder brother, that he had made no complaint of it, and that he had worked as a land agent for 2 neighboring estates for 40 years and had put by, in careful sums, 182 sovereigns, which he had left in the iron-bound chest, together with the parchment deed and the parish register on the table. He wrote that the deed was the original grant of the keep and its 2 acres of curtilage to the second son of the Hallowell house in 1748, in perpetuity and separate from the entail of the main estate, and that the register showed, on the page marked with a black ribbon, an entry of his own marriage in 1795 to a Miss Susanna Lang of the parish, and the baptism the following year of their only child, a daughter, Anne Hallowell, from whom, he wrote, he had been separated by her mother's people after Susanna's death in childbed of a second child, and of whom he had been able to trace only that she had married in 1817 a Mr. John Mercer of Bristol. He asked that whoever found the room take from it what was needful and set right, if it could still be set right, the standing of any of Anne's line whom the finder might discover living. He hoped, he wrote, that the finder would be kind and would sit sometimes by the fire he had laid, and he closed by wishing them peace. Eleanor read the letter through twice, laid it back on the table, and sat for a long while without moving, understanding in careful order that Mr. John Mercer of Bristol had been her father's father, that Anne Hallowell had been her own grandmother, that the keep and its 2 acres were and had always been separate from the estate she had been turned out of, and that she was not a charity of the Hallowell house, but the great-granddaughter of the man whose chair she sat in. Then she stood, took up the candle, and went down the stairs to lay a fresh fire and to sleep. In the morning, Eleanor Mercer began her work in the order Mrs. Bramble would have set it. She went first to the village of Norley on foot, 3 miles by the field path along the ridge and down through the beech coppice, carrying the parchment deed and the parish register wrapped in a piece of oiled linen inside her canvas bag, and she went to the office of Messrs. Pettifer and Wren at Ludham, 5 miles further, by the carrier's cart. Mr. Pettifer, a small tidy man of about 50 in a grey frock coat, received her in a small book-lined room, listened without interrupting while she laid the deed on his desk and turned the register to the marked page, and then read for a full quarter of an hour in silence, comparing the deed's wording with an entry in a volume of estate abstracts he took down from a shelf. At the end he set down his spectacles and said only, "Miss Mercer, this deed has never been extinguished." And then, after a pause, "and the entail cannot touch it." Eleanor asked him to hold the papers in his safe until further instruction, to file a copy of the deed with the county registry at Ludham that week, and to prepare a short statement of the descent from Mr. William Aldous Hallowell through Anne Hallowell and John Mercer to herself, with the register entries appended. Mr. Pettifer wrote each instruction down in a small clerkly hand, said the fee for the registry would be 3 shillings and 6pence, and Eleanor untied the corner of her handkerchief and paid him out of her 11 shillings. She walked back to the keep at dusk with 7 shillings and 6pence to her name and a receipt from the registry folded flat in her pocketbook. On Friday, as promised, Mr. Halliday came with a load of dry sticks, a sack of coal, and, unasked, a small deal table he said had been left over from a farm sale and would only be broken up otherwise. Eleanor gave him a cup of tea and asked whether he knew a slater in the parish who worked cheap. Mr. Halliday named Mr. Elijah Ford, aged about 40, of the cottages near the church, a slater and general roofer who had come back lame from the Crimea and took what work he could. Mr. Halliday said he would speak to him. On the Monday, Mr. Ford came, walked slowly round the keep with a hand on the wall, climbed the stone stair to the roof by a ladder he had brought on a donkey, and came down to say that of the roof slates about a third were cracked or slipped, that the ridge lead was sound, and that with 200 good Cornish slates, a keg of nails, and 4 days' work he would make the roof tight. His price was £2 10s, materials at cost. Eleanor asked him to begin as soon as the slates could be got, and gave him a written note to Mr. Pettifer authorizing the release of £5 against the sovereigns in the chest, which she had counted the previous night. 182, exactly as the letter said, each wrapped in a twist of tissue paper and laid in rows in a shallow tray. Mr. Ford began that Wednesday. He was joined on the second day by his son, a serious boy of 14, named Thomas Ford, who carried slates up the ladder in a canvas sling and handed them one at a time to his father on the roof. Eleanor cooked a hot dinner for them at midday each day, potatoes, a piece of bacon, a slice of bread, served at the deal table by the hearth. Mr. Ford spoke little. He touched his cap on arriving and departing, and on the fourth evening said the roof was tight, would be tight for 30 years, and that he had used 194 slates, 6 under his estimate, and would refund the difference. Eleanor asked him instead to come back the following month and rehang the outer door on new hinges, and he nodded once. Word of the work brought others. Mrs. Sarah Penry, aged about 55, the wife of the village blacksmith, walked up on a Sunday afternoon with a covered basket and left at the door 2 loaves of bread, a pot of damson preserve, and a note saying she had known Eleanor's mother and would be glad to be called on for anything within her power. Mr. Penry himself, aged 58, came the following week with a new iron latch for the outer door, refused payment, and stayed an hour looking at the hinges of the second-floor door and saying they could yet be made sound. Miss Hannah Raitt, aged 19, the vicar's niece, came with a bundle of curtain stuff her aunt had put by and did not need. She and Eleanor cut and hemmed curtains for 2 of the narrow windows in an afternoon, sitting on either side of the deal table with the tin box of Sheffield scissors and bone thimble between them. The Reverend Mr. Ashby, aged 60, walked up on a Thursday morning, sat in the chair by the hearth, drank a cup of tea, and said that if Eleanor wished he would enter her name in the current parish register as of Norley Keep, occupier and freeholder, and would do so at the vestry meeting on the first Monday of the month. Eleanor thanked him and said she wished it. He wrote the entry in his own hand a fortnight later, and Eleanor was afterwards, in the eyes of the parish, Miss Mercer of the Keep. By the middle of June the keep had a tight roof, a mended outer door on new hinges hung by Mr. Penry, a whitewashed ground-floor room with the deal table, 2 chairs from a farm sale at 4 shillings the pair, a rag rug made by Mrs. Penry from her own scraps, curtains at the windows in a plain fawn stuff, and a small kitchen dresser Mr. Halliday had knocked together from 3 old boards. The bailey had been cleared of nettles and dock by a boy named Peter Ash, aged 12, from the home farm cottages, who was paid £1 shilling a week to come 3 afternoons and pull weeds and stack them for burning. By the end of the month, the cobbles of the old bailey showed through in patches, and the yew trees had been cut back from the door. Eleanor kept a garden bed under the south wall, in which she planted from cuttings and seed given by Mrs. Penry a row of onions, a row of cabbages, a patch of potatoes, and along the wall a border of lavender begun from the muslin parcel she had brought in her tin box. On the shelf above the hearth, she set her mother's tin box on one end and the heavy brass candlestick from the sealed chamber on the other, and between them stood her father's Bible with Anne Mercer's name on the fly-leaf, and beside it a small leather-bound account book in which she now kept, in the hand Mrs. Bramble had taught her, the weekly figures of what she spent and what she took in. The sovereigns from the chest lay in Mr. Pettifer's safe at Ludham, drawn on only as needed and against written entries. Eleanor did not spend easily. She had spent £32 and 6 shillings by midsummer and had £149 and 14 shillings remaining. She wrote each sum in her book and each Sunday read the page over before laying it aside. At the Michaelmas quarter, Mr. Pettifer sent by the carrier a folded packet containing the certified copy of the deed from the county registry, a fair copy of the descent statement in his clerk's hand, and a short letter from himself informing Eleanor that a formal notice of the deed's registration had been served on Mr. Ambrose Hollowell and his solicitors, and that no counterclaim had been entered within the statutory period. Mr. Pettifer added in a line at the end that Mr. Ambrose Hollowell's solicitor had written to acknowledge the deed and to ask whether Miss Mercer would be willing to sell to the estate a strip of ground along the north end of the 2 acres for the running of a farm track. Eleanor read the letter twice, sat for a while at the deal table, and wrote in reply that she would not sell the strip but would grant a right-of-way over it, revocable at 12 months' notice, for a peppercorn rent of 1 shilling a year. Mr. Pettifer wrote back to say the terms were accepted. Eleanor entered the shilling as received in her account book on the last Sunday of September, and underneath it, in the same neat hand, the words, "First rent, Norley Keep." She sat with the book open on her knee for a long while, and did not smile, exactly, but her face was quiet, and outside the narrow window, the ivy on the wall was beginning to turn its autumn color, and the small lavender border under the south wall had put up a second, softer flowering after the summer heat. By November, the parish knew her. The baker, Mr. Coles, aged 45, kept back for her each Saturday 2 small loaves, and would not accept payment for the second. Eleanor paid him for the first, and made him a linen cap for his wife in return for the second, and thereafter the arrangement held without further discussion. The carrier's boy left her post at the outer door in a tin box she had set on the sill for that purpose. Mrs. Penry called every Sunday afternoon after church and stayed an hour. Miss Raitt brought her, in November, a black kitten, which had been born in the vicarage stable, and Eleanor kept it, and called it Bramble, for the shawl and the woman both, and it slept on the rag rug by the hearth, and grew into a broad-faced cat that caught mice along the plinth of the keep. On the first Sunday of Advent, in the pew that had been assigned her by the churchwarden at Mr. Ashby's direction, Eleanor sat between Mrs. Penry and Miss Raitt and the Reverend Mr. Ashby, reading the parish notices, mentioned that Miss Mercer of the Keep had given £2 toward the repair of the church clock, and the congregation turned, briefly and without fuss, to look at her, and she inclined her head once in acknowledgment, and the service went on. The Keep by then was warm. Eleanor had a bedstead on the first floor made up by Mr. Penry from Good Elm at a cost of £1 and 2 shillings, a straw mattress covered in ticking she had sewn herself, sheets of unbleached linen she had bought at Ludham Market for 4 shillings the pair, and a coverlet quilted from squares Mrs. Penry and Miss Raitt had helped her piece together on winter evenings in the ground-floor room by the fire. The sealed chamber on the second floor she had cleared and cleaned, but she had left the oak table and the chair where they stood, and she had put the parchment deed and the parish register, once returned by Mr. Pettifer, in the iron-bound chest, together with a fair copy of Mr. William Aldous Hollowell's letter and a note of her own, addressed in her turn, to whoever finds this room open, in which she recorded the date on which she had entered, the name of the man who had left it for her, and the small list of what she had done with what he had given her. She locked the chest, hung the key on a nail beside the hearth, and did not go into the room often. But on the first day of each month she went up, opened the window a hand's breadth to air it, sat a moment in the chair, and came down again to her work. On a still evening in the following spring, a year to the week from the day Mr. Halliday had set her trunk down inside the low-arched door, Eleanor Mercer sat in the chair by the hearth in the ground-floor room of the Keep, with her account book closed on her knee, and the black cat Bramble asleep on the rag rug at her feet. The fire was low and orderly. On the shelf above the hearth stood her mother's tin box at one end, and Mr. William Aldous Hollowell's heavy brass candlestick at the other, and between them her father's Bible with Anne Mercer's name on the fly-leaf, and beside it the small leather account book in the hand Mrs. Bramble had taught her. 2 objects from 2 people who had loved a child they had not been allowed to see grown. Anne Mercer, dead at 34, who had left her a bone thimble and a folded square of unfinished linen, and Mr. William Aldous Hollowell, dead in this Keep in a year she would never know exactly, who had left her 182 sovereigns and a plain letter and a parish register with a black ribbon at the page. Eleanor thought of Mrs. Bramble in her bombazine and her polished keys, who had taught her to count pillow slips and to finish work in spite of bad news, and of Mr. Ambrose Hollowell in the great house half a mile down the beach avenue, who had turned her out and did not know, and need not know, what he had turned her into. Eleanor Mercer was 22 and had 11 shillings in the corner of a handkerchief and a tin box of her mother's sewing things. And with that she had entered the old castle keep at Norley that no one had crossed in 80 years. It was the best 11 shillings she ever spent. If this story has stayed with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who would sit quietly by a fire and listen to the end. And before you go, consider this. Is there a place, a room, or a life that others have called worthless that you have been asked to make your own? What might you find there if you only open the door?